Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. Welcome to our weekly performance and interview series. I say this every week, but it always rings true. For those of you that have watched this before, welcome back. For those of you that are new, welcome. And if you're watching this like months from now, welcome anyways. Today we have the great pleasure of having a wonderful musician and composer with us today. This is the great Alex Guilbert, and I've known Alex for many years. We play here and there spottedly, because usually with the band it's bass, drums, and saxophone without chords, but we have had occasion to play at like sessions and things. And besides being a tremendous musician and improviser, he's one of, I would say, one of the Pacific Northwest premier like stride pianists as well. He's very humble. He will deny this. He also puts together, helps assemble the Piano Starts Here series at the Royal Room in Seattle. And he also makes his living by cranking out songs for video games. He's a video game music composer professionally. So tons of great things. And you've been on the scene for many, many years. So number one, welcome. Thank you for coming to join us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, little old me, to be interviewed by you. It's an honor. It's an honor.
It's a long time coming. So what we're going to do is we'll conduct the interview for about 45 minutes, and then the last 15 minutes will be opened up for questions. If you have questions for us, you can throw them in the comments now or as we're doing this, and we'll get to them towards the end of the interview. And even if we can't get to them in real time, we can come back and do it later, after the interview concludes. So. And also, after the interview is over, we're going to take a brief little pause, and then we're going to do a set of music from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Of all original music of Alex's and mine, and we'll be doing that with Jacques Willis on drums and Greg Feingold on bass. So that'll be starting soon as well. So be sure to tune in for that if you can join us. Okay, and we're also, I should add, we're broadcasting today from the beautiful Spanish ballroom of the McMenamins Elks Temple here in Tacoma, Washington, and we're very grateful to be able to partner with them to make this series happen. So, Alex, can you talk a little bit about how you got started in music? You wear so many hats and do so many things, but where did you grow up? Where are you from? Where did you start, and how did that come about?
Well, I'm originally from New York, but I've lived in Seattle area most of my life. We moved here when I was a kid, and lived in New York long enough for Seattle to feel still odd to me. Been around New Yorkers my whole life, I guess I'd call myself a Seattleite at heart. But I don't come from a musical family, so as a kid I grew up on like just the whatever AOR was on the radio, Triumph and Ozzy and like all the stuff like that was playing in the 70s and the 80s, I kind of discovered, my dad listened to classical music, so I had like a lot of Beethoven and Mozart in my background from being a really young kid, but I played guitar as a younger kid, and then became fascinated with classical music and piano around 13, 14. So I started taking lessons, and that's a very late age to start playing piano. So I always, I knew that classical music wasn't really going to be my thing. Like that, in order to have a career in that, you have to start it before the age of 10. Yeah, in the womb. Yeah. So and also, I was also interested in a lot of other things. Like before I got into piano, I was really into punk, and I was a bit of a wayward youth. So anyway, yeah, I guess when I kind of slowly became more exposed to jazz, and back then it was, Wynton Marsalis was very much on the scene and very influential. So. But the thing that really got me, I was actually driving. I was 16 years old, driving to my job at the time. I heard Ornette Coleman, Pat Metheny, Ornette Coleman song X on the radio, KBCS.
It wouldn't be played on KPLU, I'm pretty sure.
No, and I mean, I forever, I will always forever appreciate KBCS. My God, what a great radio station. They're still great. But yeah, I heard that, and I was just like, wow. can't believe what I'm, it completely blew my mind. And that was kind of the moment that I realized that I was like, I decided I wanted to play jazz. So, I wasn't in jazz band though in high school. So I didn't really like start playing jazz in earnest until college. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious because as far as influences go, I'm curious what year you were born, because I know depending on the artists that I talk to, we've interviewed Julian Priester multiple times, or Bill Ramsey, and obviously you're not as old as those guys, but depending on where people are born, like I was born in '78, and so for me, like hip hop was a huge part of my thing, where a lot of the older musicians maybe not so much. So what year were you born?
I was born in 1970, and and so I mean, hip hop was not as much a thing, though I think Public Enemy was something I in college, like I really got into. But yeah, I mean, part of it was just, growing up in Bellevue on the east side, like it wasn't as prevalent. And at that time I also had become interested in jazz. And I kind of started listening to jazz obsessively at that point in my life.
So prior to having Ornette and Pat Metheny grab your attention with Song X, were there other, as you're coming from classical, getting new ear and facility and all that kind of stuff together, were there other jazz artists that you were aware of to be even listening? I mean, how did you even get aware of KBCS to begin with? I mean, as a young student.
Well, yeah, I mean, back then it was a lot different, because you'd go to the local record store and there'd be some guy, like who worked there, just be like, hey, check this out. And so you didn't, like, it was really hard to gain knowledge about what music was, where the music was, essentially, like, and especially in a place like Bellevue, where, like, when I was that age, I would get on the bus and go to Seattle as often as I could, just to be, like, in a place where there was some culture, but I think I worked at Tower Records in high school as well. I was like, yeah, it was funny because they didn't, I applied there, and I applied to work in the classical section, and the guy was like, he's like, how could you don't know anything, like how, and he interviewed me, and he was like, okay, who wrote the War Requiem? And I, for some reason, I knew, Benjamin Britten wrote the War Requiem, and he was like, okay, you're hired. and so I worked at Tower Records, and I would, that was how I started slowly to gain knowledge, because they would have like cutout bins with, this was when CDs were taking over, so they were just getting rid of all their LPs, so I'd get like Charles Mingus LPs, or like, back then World Saxophone Quartet was really, they were hugely popular for a group like that. I remember a friend of mine and I snuck into one of their shows once at the Ballard, what was it called? I can't remember there was a club in Ballard where World Saxophone Quartet was playing. We were not 21, but we managed to get in. That was an amazing experience. But yeah, it was a lot slower to, I think, gain in knowledge of where the cool music was, and I mean, now you've just got it all at your fingertips, and for better or worse, all the algorithms are, essentially trying to, they're trying to manipulate you into listening to certain music when you go on Spotify, for instance, but yeah, so.
Well, I mean, it's interesting too. I mean, when you say like cool music, depending on who you talk to, that means different things, right? I mean,
yeah.
and the beautiful thing about Seattle and in this region, I would say, particularly Seattle, there's so much of everything, and there's so many great players doing so many great things. Whether it's blues or classical or jazz, and within jazz, whatever that means to so many people, and free music. There's a lot of really cool stuff happening. And I would say too, also, working at Tower Records during that time frame, it sounds like mid to late 80s, early 90s. Is that a fair assumption?
Late 80s, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that when stuff was just starting to happen in Seattle with so many great bands too across the board, I mean.
Yeah, and I mean, that was kind of part of my high school experience, was going to those punk shows, and as a matter of fact, one of the ones I remember, the most was in Tacoma at the, what was it called, the World Theater or something? I can't remember, but I saw the Melvins there, like in 1986, I think, and that was just, yeah. I mean, so all those bands were forming. You know, Nirvana had not yet formed, but they were the Green River and Mudhoney was around.
Yeah. This is a little before my time, and I'm not talking trash at all. But I mean, I've heard stories of the Phoenix Underground in Seattle. Did you spend much time there seeing shows, or?
I saw a few shows there. I'm trying to remember. I saw that there was a popular kind of Red Hot Chili Peppers like band at the time that I saw there. It wasn't the Red Hot Chili Peppers, but can't remember what they were called. Kind of funk band. But
So you didn't. What high were you? Which high school did you attend?
Bellevue High School.
Bellevue. And so you did not play in the jazz band at all there?
No, I probably should have, you know, or I should have tried at least, but at the time I was such a, you know, I was a very shy kid, and also like just starting to learn piano, really, essentially. Like I mean, I had to cram, you know, to get stuff together for my college entry audition. So, you know, and that was just classical music, essentially.
Well, so regarding jazz, I mean, you're listening to some things. Did you have an instructor, anyone that you were taking lessons with? Because I know there were great teachers in the area around that time.
Not jazz instructors, really. My first jazz instructor was actually, I went to Western for a year before transferring to the UW, and Julian McDonough's dad was my first. Yeah.
Bill McDonough is
Bill
great. I
McDonough,
love that
yeah,
guy.
Yeah, he was awesome. I have not seen him since then, but of course I've seen Julian, and he's also awesome. He was great, and he was very, very supportive, and kind of started teaching me. He was actually a really great teacher, and started teaching me the basics of like how to voice chords, and so. And he kind of encouraged me, you know, like I think you should try and go to the UW, because there's just more of a scene in Seattle, and he was very encouraging, like especially considering where I was at, because I had gotten nowhere at the time. I could barely play, but.
Well, so when you were attending Western, who was on the faculty at that time? I mean, aside of, I mean, you were up hanging out with Bill, but who else was around? Because they've had a jazz scene there for many, 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 many years.
Yeah, that was Chuck Israels was the head of the jazz department, but I was studying classical, so I studied with Ford Hill, who was a really great teacher, and I learned a ton from him. In, you know, a year and a quarter is how long I went there. So it wasn't long enough to you know, like my sight reading was pretty terrible, and you know but I did learn a fair amount about classical piano technique from him. But
Were there any places to maybe play or go see gigs while you were attending Western in Bellingham? Do you recall anything?
Not really. I didn't do I didn't go out much. When I was in Bellingham, that was part of the reason I went back to Seattle, is because I felt a little isolated there. So it was my own fault, you know. It wasn't. I mean, it was actually like the Western Music Department was a very supportive scene. It was very small, though, you know. And
well, so then you made the transition to UW, and so when you were going to UW, I'm assuming you were majoring in still classical piano. Is that correct? Or
no. I wanted to major in jazz, and you know, it took me a couple quarters of, you know, first thing I did was call Mark Seals, you know, and he was like, he gave me, he was like, you're good enough to, almost good enough to be in the department, but here you need to work on these things first. And then after a couple quarters, he was like, yeah, so I became a jazz major then. But as you can see, it's like, it was a kind of a struggle for me, like just being a late bloomer in this.
Well, so you got into UW. So who was around on the faculty at that time when you were there?
Oh, that was Roy Cummings, Mark, of course. You know, I had my theory classes with like Diane Thome and John Ron was there. And yeah, I mean, there were a lot of great, you know, there were different instructors for jazz. Like, I remember Jeff Johnson was there for a bit.
Was Doug Miller around at that time
Doug
too?
Miller was there for a bit as well. Sweet guy. Like, he was great. Always very encouraging. And I mean, same with Jeff Johnson. Like, all those guys were.
What about students? Because I know, I just know from around the scene, I mean, there were some associations that you had from school there. So who were some other students that were kind of learning and getting things together there at the time?
Yeah, and that's actually how I really feel like I learned. Because I started gigging, you know, but like shortly after, you know, starting school there and being in the combos and stuff and meeting people. And of course there was Tom Marriott, so Tom and Ev Stern and I had a gig, and Jose Martinez, like that was usually the band. We had a regular gig for a while at this place called the Speakeasy in Belltown. Like, there were tons of people playing in Belltown every Friday and Saturday night. It was an awesome scene. But also like Mark Taylor and Rob Davis, who I know like was a big influence on you as well. Like, yeah, I mean, like Rob Davis, just getting a window into his, like, you know, just hanging out in the practice rooms, and he would share like what he was practicing and stuff like that. That was a amazing education in and of itself, I think. So.
Can you talk a little bit about, because I know obviously, I mean, you had great instructors and great experiences academically at the school and with some of your peers outside of that, but maybe were there other local artists? I mean, I'm sure there were that you maybe liked their playing or got out to see. And in particular, I want a sidebar. Did you ever have any associations with Jerome Gray?
No, unfortunately, I did not. And that's something I kind of regret. You know, I think I could have learned a lot from him. But I learned a little bit from, you know, I gleaned a little bit from people who study with him about what he was about. But yeah, I did not have any contact with him. And you know, I was always kind of on the outskirts, like, of the jazz scene.
I grew up in Tacoma. I know exactly how you feel.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the early days it was because I was into the more out stuff. So, and then now I've gone the opposite direction. I play a lot of trad music. But the thing is, I feel like the jazz scene in Seattle has always been very welcoming. So even though like I'm not hanging out all the time, when I am, I feel like part of the family. So yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of friends who I've played with a lot over the years. You know, like for instance, Craig Flory. He and I, you know, he's a good friend. And also, he's kind of one of the people who got me interested in traditional jazz. Ev Stern, I mentioned before, like we played a lot together for a long time. But so I've had, you know, kind of some long time collaborations with people. But yeah, and there, you know, there are a lot of people I find inspiring in the scene, you know. I mean, I can probably name 20 or 30 of them. I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches, really, I think, with playing jazz in Seattle.
I agree very much so. So hanging out, going to school, clubs that you would maybe go to do like jam sessions, aside from playing at the Speakeasy with Tom and those guys, were any other venues where you would go to listen to music? I'm sure Tula's was around, or other places perhaps?
Well, I mean, back then there there was the OK Hotel, which is where, you know, a lot of like Wayne Horvitz used to do a lot of stuff there and play. I mean, it's kind of what the OK Hotel has kind of morphed into the Royal Room, like seeing a lot of the people who worked at the OK Hotel are working at the Royal Room now. And so there was that whole scene there. Then there was also the Brick Street, which you've probably
Heard about it. It's before my time.
But I mean, and also, yeah, I mean, I should mention Dan Heck as like someone who, God, he did so much for the Seattle jazz scene in his time here. He always, I mean, he's kind of like you, I guess, like someone who makes things happen, you know, and I always appreciate the people who do that, because I mean, it's super impressive that you can, you know, like what you're doing here. It takes so much work and so much effort to pull people together for stuff like this. So Dan Heck, you know, he put that Brick Street session together, and then, you know, with Bebop and Destruction, they also started the Owl and Thistle session, which you're aware of, and I was in the electric version of that band for a bit. It was called Live Evil. We did a lot of the music from Miles Davis' Live Evil, and there were two keyboardists, me and Ryan Burns. Yeah, and Rob Davis was in it for a while. But yeah, the other venues, I mean, yeah, there was Tula's, and I guess like back then, you know, we'd play at the Speakeasy on Friday night, and there was a place called Good Chow. There were a bunch of different places, you know, and it was kind of like the jazz, like Belltown, much different from what it is now. Yeah. Was where people would. It was just such a great hang, because you'd have a gig in Belltown, and then people would come down after their gigs and jam and just hang out, like usually until 4 or 5 in the morning, like type of thing. I was in my 20s, so I could do that back then. I'm trying to think of other venues, but I mean, those were like kind of the haunts, you know, like Tula's, Brick Street, later Owl and Thistle, Speakeasy, Good Chow, yeah. Yeah.
No, that's all good stuff. I'm curious. I remember going to college, and you know, I attended Cornish and graduated in 2002. But I had very fond memories of artists that they would bring in to do workshops and clinics and things that were, you know, made a large impact on me as a student at the time. Now I know attending UW probably had similar experiences. Can you recall any traveling musicians that came through that gave good advice, or things that you really were impacted positively by, or negatively, I should say?
Yeah, let me think here. God, I mean, this is kind of like off the beaten path, but I also I played Indonesian music in for a while, because UW has a very like a pretty renowned ethnomusicology department, and I was interested in gamelan music. So, you know, one of the people who really influenced me was the Indonesian music instructor, Endo Sawanda. He was just a master of all that music, and he left. Like, I got to study with him for about 2 years, and he left, went back to Indonesia. At that point, I kind of stopped playing in the gamelan, because I felt like I needed to focus, just laser focus on piano too. But he was a great influence, just very open guy, and to get the perspective on a different, like a deep perspective on a different type of music like that, was really valuable to me. And it is similar to jazz in a lot of ways. In gamelan, you you follow a form, you know, and you improvise within it. Yeah, so I'm trying to think of other influential people in my academic career. God.
It's a broad question. I mean, I have like, I can remember, they brought out Joanne Brackeen was there at Cornish, Jeff Hamilton and John Clayton, Phil Markowitz. Oh shoot, I can see the person. I can't remember the name, but I mean, Reggie Workman came one time, and just everybody had something different to say that I can recall from each thing, like something to take away from. And I'm just curious because I know UW would always bring people in, so I was just curious if anyone really made a memorable impact.
I'm trying to think. Like I do remember having, this doesn't really have anything to do with the UW, but like I had a great conversation with Andrew Hill once, and that was actually at Cornish.
Yeah.
He was playing a concert there, and I've always been a huge fan of Andrew Hill. I mean, I think there's some magic in his playing that I think is really underrated. And so he was on his break. He spent his whole set break talking to me and was just very generous with his time and I don't know. I mean, I guess one of the things about Andrew Hill and I guess you could probably say the same about Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock is they're of this 60s generation, and I mean he was the real deal, like he was what the 60s were supposed to be about in a way, like peace, love, just generosity of spirit. So I mean, just seeing, and seeing that example from musicians, I think is really the most important thing in a way. Is just being non-judgmental, being supportive, showing love towards someone just for the fact that they are interested in this path, No, that's kind of a labyrinthian answer to your question.
No, it's a great answer. It's a great answer. I always think it's kind of like, jazz musicians are kind of like the Jedi of the music world, and it's not a path for everybody, and it's certainly not easy. And there are many rewards, and there's also it can be brutal. I'm curious your opinions about Andrew Hill's music. I mean, I know your opinions based on what you're saying right now, or have a general idea. But in terms of like commercial success, you talk about someone like Oscar Peterson versus Andrew Hill. Do you think that maybe it's more Oscar Peterson's music would be more like commercially viable and acceptable, so therefore more people know about him versus Andrew Hill, or like Nat King Cole? Just a penny for your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's not a lot of commercial viability built into Andrew Hill's music, because I think it does demand some more of a type of attention that I think people are not as willing to put into music, most people. So there's that aspect. I don't consider it to be difficult music, and as a matter of fact, some of his stuff is very, very triadic and very simple, but I think the way he touches the piano and the way he phrases is I don't know. There's something. There are very few players that have that kind of depth, and it is I consider it magic in a way. So it's hard for me to explain in words, but I feel that way. When I hear there are a few other players like that, like Abdullah Ibrahim. When he, and these are like I'm thinking solo piano too. Like all these guys play great solo piano. Or Randy Weston is another one where just the way of the phrasing and touching the piano is different. It's
It's hard to explain that. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying, but it's hard to explain it to someone else, particularly, I mean, even if they're a musician or not a musician. You know, I heard a recording the other day. You know, it's not just about technique and maybe the chords that they're choosing, but it's how they get the sound and like you're saying, phrasing and all these little subtle things. It was Mel Torme and George Shearing, and they did a version of A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square. And the musicality of it, I mean, both of those guys are geniuses, but you hear how they're doing what they do, and it's like, well, you can't help but be, if you're a musician or have studied some sort of music, you can't help but be moved by it.
Yeah.
But two, just to see what they're doing with just simple little things. It's, yeah, no, I understand it. It's hard to convey that to people that don't know, and you don't know unless you've put in some time to meet them halfway, you know?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, no, you know, most people don't know what it is to touch the keys, you know, and I mean, though there are a lot of people who are just avid listeners who get it, you know, who just love listening and don't play. I know plenty of people who are in that category who can kind of feel that, and I don't think it's necessary to be a musician to appreciate that stuff, but yeah, I mean, obviously, if you put in tens of thousands of hours towards trying to do this thing, like it sometimes you're just awestruck by it, and there's no way to explain it. And I think with Andrew Hill and with Randy Weston and Abdul Ibrahim, those guys I mentioned before, like I feel like that. What blows me away about that is that I think it comes out of Duke Ellington, in that Duke Ellington played the piano in a different way from what, you know, the classical technique was, you know, and he kind of invented his own technique, which is an incredible thing to say in a way. And the amount of, like, the way he put weight into the keys and stuff. And I think there's a tradition there that very few players tap into. And I don't consider myself to be one of them, really.
Yeah, well, I would argue that that's not true, but I mean, I've seen your videos, and I have a million questions that I've come up in having this conversation just now, and I want to talk about you as a composer, and I want to talk about the video game stuff.
Okay.
I also want to talk about the Piano Starts Here series. So maybe we should do before we do that. I have a quick question. Aside from the folks that you're mentioning, as you were getting this stuff together and learning how to play and deal with jazz, were there any specific jazz pianists that you were really into, like really checked out and studied and transcribed or listened to quite a bit?
I've listened to Keith Jarrett kind of like an addict.
Yeah.
Has like, I mean, and yeah, I mean, I'd say like of all the pianists, I probably listened to Keith Jarrett the most. And you know, sometimes it's been like a matter of like listening to the same track like 12 times a day or whatever. Like you know, there have been, I've had periods like that. And you know, I mean, Herbie Hancock as well, Paul Bley, and yeah, so more recently. You know, more recently I've been just listening to a lot of James P. Johnson and early Earl Hines, early Teddy Wilson, and just yeah, I mean, there's just such a rich tradition there of like that goes back. I think, you know, I think about like you know, since I've embarked on really taking this stride piano thing seriously, like I've just come to the realization, you know, no one's ever played piano better than James P. Johnson. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, there's no such thing as evolution in jazz. Like, I mean, and I kind of disagree with the way it's taught that sometimes, because I feel like whether it's intentional or not, like a lot of jazz history courses are kind of taught as like, well, jazz started out real simple and got more complex, and I don't feel that way. Like it's not that way. Like I mean, the technique of Louis Armstrong is perfect, and it's not less advanced than the technique of Dizzy Gillespie or yeah. I mean, it's just different. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there are, I guess, lately I've been transcribing, you know, a lot of early jazz, and even like Dick Spiderback solos and, you know, Lester Young and stuff like that. I've been trying to really dig into that. And I, you know, like I learned a Teddy Wilson solo note for note, which was really hard. I don't know, like in the trad community, like I play with a bunch of people who are really into learning. Like, you know, Jacob Zimmerman, like he knows a ton of solos, just note for note, you know, and can play them. And yeah, there are a lot of people like that in the trad community, also in the jazz community as a whole. Sure. It's not something I, you know, when I used to transcribe before, I would transcribe the solo, but not learn it, or maybe learn parts of it, or learn a phrase and transpose it into different keys and stuff, which is also there's a lot of more utility to that in a way, but learning a whole entire solo is also a good exercise, and
Yes. Yeah, I've given that a lot of thought. Like, if it's an album, sure, because maybe it's a couple courses. Those live albums, there's like 8,000 courses. That's tough. That's tough. So, all right. Well, selfishly, I would love to ask you, just barrage you with questions. And I'm gonna do 5 more minutes of questions, and we'll open things up for the interview. And I'm kind of hoping that no one has questions, because I have a bunch more questions. So, anyways, can you talk a little bit about the Piano Starts Here, that series, and what that's all about?
Yes. I've been hosting and curating that series at the Royal Room for probably about 7 years now. Yeah, it came out of, like, so Wayne Horvitz, I played for it a few times, and I would just email Wayne like, oh, I have an idea for a theme. And he finally was just like, do you want to just curate it? So I've been doing that since then, and it took some time, but it's now it's like a very well attended series. And so what we do is we pick a theme. It's usually 2 jazz pianist composers. Like the next one we're doing is actually Benny Golson, Wayne Shorter. So they're not pianists, but yeah, so it's usually a theme of 2. It kind of works well that way, because you get it's interesting to see the interplay between the 2. And we'll have usually 4 pianists total performing. And basically they get to play about 20 to 30 minutes worth of music each by those composers or inspired by them. And it's a great opportunity because, you know, first of all, the piano is really nice at the Royal Room. It's a great venue, and people go there to listen, which, you know, where else does that where else does that happen besides colleges and at Benaroya or whatever? But it's like a recital, but for improvising musicians. And sometimes we pick themes that are not jazz oriented, like we're doing a Fiona Apple, Tori Amos theme later this year, which I think should be really fun. So yeah, I mean, it's daunting. Like you're there like with unbelievable piano players, and you have to just be up there by yourself, playing and so yeah, Jeremy Bacon posted the other day that he always feels like feels like a Shark Tank being in there, but I don't know. I mean, we're supportive with one another as well.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I know a fair amount of most of the piano players in Seattle, and I wouldn't say anyone strikes me as like a shark type personality. Everyone's super cool. For the most part.
Not going to name any names, yeah.
So, all right, well, cool. How can people find out more information about that?
You can go on the Royal Room's website. That's probably the best way to do it. And that should have there's also a Piano Starts Here Facebook. There's the Royal Room's Facebook page, which has all the listings and the schedule for the year, as well as the Piano Starts Here Facebook page. That's probably the best place to go.
I know we're at that time. Does anybody have any questions for Alex or myself about any of the things we've discussed so far? If so, please let me know and put them in the comments. So, since there's no questions, I want to ask. I want to go to video game music. So you've been doing this now for 18 years, composing video game music, roughly?
Yeah. I've worked in a couple different video game studios. I just got into it by accident, really. Really by accident. And basically what happened is a friend of mine called me who I hadn't talked to in a long time, and we got to talking. He was asking for Gunnar Folsom's phone number, a drummer we know. Yeah. And that's why he called me, but we got to talking for like an hour, and he was a audio director of a video game studio, and he said, "Hey, you'd be really good at this. You should like come do an internship." And so I did that, and that was like 2003. And then he left, and so I took over his job, which was ridiculous. I was not at all qualified at the time to be audio director. So it was like daily, like daily panic attacks. But like eventually, like after several months and years, I learned the craft, and so I was doing audio as well as composing music. So I would be essentially in charge of all the audio of whatever game we were working on at the time.
Are there any types of platforms or games that you prefer? I mean, if you go back to I started gaming in the late 80s, early 90s, like Nintendo, you have the 8-bit sounds and all that versus what we have now. Any preference for you, or?
Well, now pretty much everything has to be like very well produced. So, I mean, and you pretty much produce the same music no matter what platform at this point. When I first started, there were MIDI, like general MIDI types of engines for games. But now it's pretty much you just produce the audio, and you can feed it into. I mean, the way people compose music for games is oftentimes non-linear. So you'll compose music that responds to what's going on in the game. So there's a lot of ways to do that. I guess like in terms of genre, like I've worked on quite a few horror games, and I've always found that to be fun.
Any games? I mean, it sounds like 18 years. You probably worked on tons of games. Any games that have been your favorite to work on? I'll say this: favorite to work on and least favorite to work on. How about that?
Well, the last game I worked on, and this is actually the last game I worked on, might have been my favorite, but it never got made. And this is part of the thing about the game industry is that I actually haven't shipped a game. Like I haven't had my music in a game that has shipped and is out on the market since 2015. Wow. Because I worked on this game for several years, 3-4 years, and it never got made. But it was a pretty awesome concept. It was a vampire game based in Seattle. And yeah, I don't know if it will ever get made, to be honest. Like, yeah.
Maybe if it's in the queue, if you could like somehow tie it to Grey's Anatomy, then it would take off like gangbusters. I don't know. We'll see. Well, based on what you're talking about, the process of making these games being non-linear and reacting to what's going on, it sounds like jazz musicians might be suited to that kind of thing because that's what we're always having to do, listening and reacting and, spontaneously composing music depending on what's happening in the moment. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I think having improvising skills is, it's a great. How many jazz musicians do you know who aren't also composers? Playing jazz is a great springboard into composing music in general, but I think having a reactive kind of attitude towards music, the way a jazz musician does, is helpful. I think one of the things that we tend to do in video game music is we tend to get stuck in ostinatos and just a lot of repetition, because basically if you have, so imagine
really quickly for people that don't know what the heck you're talking about, can you explain ostinato? I know, but
an ostinato is just a repeated phrase. So and oftentimes it'll be in the bass or the low strings or something. So if you think about a game like think about a first-person shooter game where you've got you've got yourself, you've got your threats out there in the world, and you might have like a bass track that's playing always, and then say a track that comes in and out depending on like how close the enemies are. And then you might change the whole state of the music depending on whether or not someone's firing at you or something. You'll find like the pitfall of that is that you can't tell a story through the music because you don't know what the story is going to be, right? Right. So what we get is a lot of like layering, a lot of this really like static music that has just layers that are coming in and out. You get what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I have two small children, so I bought a Nintendo Switch. We have questions? Yeah. Oh, darn it. Not darn. No, thank you for asking the questions, but let me finish my question. I'll get to it. And so I bought a Nintendo Switch because of all the Mario games. And what I was noticing is like you'll play some of these Mario games and like you're in one thing and all of a sudden like a new thing happens and all of a sudden it just immediately jumps to a new song. Like just cuts whatever you are and it's just all of a sudden you're in a new song to fit what's happening. It's just like
yeah, and there are composers out there. There's this, like one of the pioneers, this guy Nate Grigg. He's like one of the pioneers and lives in this area, I think, still, of like adaptive music is what it's called. Had really complicated ways of like switching from scenario to scenario, from musical scenario to musical scenario. And as you can imagine, it can get pretty convoluted if you have to change from one piece to another. Might be in a different key, whatever, Yeah, so.
Cool. Well, all right. So questions. What do we got?
So this is a request from an audience member. They want Alex to talk a little bit more about his interest and study of both stride piano.
So the question is, can you talk a little bit more about your interest in study of stride piano?
Can I talk about my interest in study in stride piano? That's all I can talk about lately. I played in a traditional jazz. I really don't like the term traditional jazz, but
And for people that know, what does that mean?
it basically means early jazz, like 20s and 30s jazz, and people who are really into it, moldy figs as they like to call themselves, are can really have their own definitions of what it is and isn't. But basically, this band. We played at the New Orleans. It was actually Dave Holo's band. I don't know if you knew him, but he passed away recently. And it's a big loss for all of us. But anyway, we played every Tuesday for 10 years at the New Orleans in Pioneer Square, and so I learned a lot of the repertoire that way. And I've always loved that music, but I never got really, I played it and then I started finding myself, playing with people who were really good at it and who really know the stuff. And just about, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, or maybe more than that, but I was like, I'm playing all this 20s music, and I listen to it, but I'm not really like learning it. And so I just decided in earnest to like really start learning some stride piano. I always could reach a 10th, so like the 10ths were never that hard for me, but I started first of all trying to figure out what they're doing in their left hand besides just root, chord, fifth chord.
So for people that don't know what you're talking, like a 10th, because I suck at this, but like it's a big distance on the piano, and I've got medium-sized hands, and I can't do it without bumping other keys. So you're saying you can reach that distance pretty easily.
Well, there are some like if I'm walking down in some certain keys, like so walking 10ths, which is where you're just taking this interval and going up and down. That there are some keys where I just don't do it, but yeah, so I started kind of picking apart, like what Teddy Wilson, his earliest recordings from about 33, I think. It's just miraculous piano playing. Like it's that and the early Earl Hines stuff, which is what Teddy's stuff is kind of based on that. Like Earl Hines is the first jazz pianist. And
I've heard some of these folks, and correct me if I'm wrong, you probably know better than I, but would actually have the kind of the tissue between their hands kind of cut so that they could reach further distances. Do you know anything about this?
I don't, but there is a story about Keith Jarrett when he was a kid, like pulling on his thumb. And I don't know if you've noticed, like when you watch him play, like his thumbs are they seem to like be able to reach further. They seem to have a mind of their own too, like he does all that stuff with the inner voices. But I haven't heard about that. That sounds painful, and do not try it at home. It sounds potentially dangerous, and yeah. So I guess the difference in stride piano is, first of all, like a lot of the earlier players like James P. Johnson and Fats Waller, the pre-Earl Hines people, were improvising a little less than you do in jazz. And then Earl Hines came along, and it's still stride piano, but it's also just so, like, he was just such a genius. Like, he could just do anything on the piano, and so it's so free, and that's where kind of jazz piano started, in my opinion, because I kind of don't consider James P. Johnson or even Fats Waller to be jazz. They're kind of like proto-jazz. Or another player, like during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time learning a bunch of Jelly Roll Morton solos. Also another just amazing player, but there's a little less improvising going on there,
And for people that don't know, I mean, you say you're learning this stuff, but I remember watching you post videos of these online as you're doing these things, and they're very impressive and informational.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a really daunting, it's hard to try and dive into that. I mean, there are people who specialize in it, and around the country. They're just there's a handful of people, and my goal is to kind of be among that group, and there's like, I don't know if you know Ray Shelbred, but he's a great stride player, and he lives in Seattle. He was friends and kind of like understudy to Earl Hines. Like he spent a lot of time with him back in the day, and so like he's probably the only other one I know in Seattle who really, I mean, and he's way beyond where I'm at. Like that's what he does. He plays, he knows all those. There's like another thing about the trad repertoire is like it's another 1,000 tunes on top of the regular jazz repertoire. So I've been trying to, my goal is to be able to like go sit in at jam sessions, where people, I mean, and they're all like in New York essentially, but right. There's this guy Dennis Lichtman who does a jam session at a place called Mona's, and you know, he live streams it. And it's like they're all calling these tunes like clarinet marmalade and cornet chop suey, and like there's just a huge world of music there that is kind of untapped by most musicians. So
Awesome. Well, thank you. Any other questions? No. All right. Cool. I want to go back. Actually, we're short on time here. So, if people want to learn more about you and the projects that you're doing, I know you have, you're doing all the video game stuff, you're doing the Piano Starts Here series, you have regular gigs and things that you do, and sideman work, and then there's also there's a trad band that you're running as well.
yeah, I have I co-run a trad band with a drummer vocalist named Mike Doherty, and it's called TOP Jazz Band. And so we play. We've been playing a lot for Swing at Seattle, which is at the Polish Center on Capitol Hill. It's a great event. Yeah, so we play for a lot. I play for a lot of dances when they're happening.
Do you teach as well?
No, I started doing it a little bit when, because I lost my job around the time the pandemic started, my day job, and I started teaching, and then more like video game music or video game work in general started coming in. I'm not even just doing music right now.
So if someone wanted to study with you, even though you're not teaching, if they hounded you and hounded you and hounded you, or if someone wanted to book you for a gig, how would they get in touch with you? Where can they find information about how to reach you?
My website is alexguilbert.com.
That's Guilbert.
Yeah, Guilbert, and there you can contact me through there. You could look me up on Facebook. I usually post when I'm playing. I also have just started doing a regular Thursday gig, kind of a trad thing in Bellevue, though it's been postponed now thanks to COVID. Thanks, COVID.
Well, all right, yeah. Well, we're going to play some music today, and we're looking forward to doing a bunch of, as this is all original music, it's glad to have you here on this because you're writing stuff. So we're looking forward to doing that. Thank you so much for being a guest with us today and making the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And thank you to our viewers for checking it out. Hopefully you can tune in and join us for the concert here in a little bit. If you enjoy the value of the programming that we're doing, again, we do these interviews and the live streams and the concerts, which are in person and live streamed, and the classes. If you want to support the work that we're doing, you can make a donation via Venmo or PayPal or mailing a check. And all of that information is at the beginning of this post. But thank you so much. There's a bunch of other great stuff coming up, so keep an eye on the calendar. If you want to get details mailed to you about what's happening, you can join our email list, and that's on our website. Information about how to do that, and that's www.kkworldorchestra.org. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you later.